Welcome to today's show, Fascination Israel. I love these beautiful chants and chorals. Unfortunately, I don't understand them, since they are sung in Latin. For centuries, Latin was the language of religion, science, and literature. Until the 19th century, at the universities of Europe, lectures were held in Latin. Can you imagine that Latin would be revived today? That someone would get up in Germany, for example, and want to make Latin the national language? Unthinkable. Today, I want to introduce you to a rather interesting person who achieved the impossible and revived an ancient language. And I would like to invite you to join me on my trip to Israel in search of traces of this revival. Hebrew. It is the ancient language of the Hebrews, the children of Israel, also called the language of Moses. It was the national language of Israel for centuries. But that changed with the violent expulsion of the Jewish people in the year 70 AD. Scattered around the world and through the centuries, the Hebrew language was reduced for religious matters only. But how is it that in Israel today, the official language is once again Hebrew? Gottfried Bühler follows a hot trail that leads him to Jerusalem, to the Academy of the Hebrew Language. It owes its foundation to a man who almost single-handedly brought about the revival of the Hebrew language. Professor Stephen Fasberg and Dr. Gabriel Birnbaum share their specialist knowledge of a breathtaking story with Gottfried Bühler.
Gentlemen, we're sitting here talking about one of the biggest miracles the last 150 years. How did it come that a dead language was revived?
It is connected very much to one person, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, in whose room we are actually sitting now. He was actually on the one hand the genius, on the other hand the lunatic, who had this crazy idea that a language that hadn't been spoken for 1700 years will be revitalized.
Please, allow me. I am Eliezer Yitzhak Perlman, born in Lithuania in January 1858, which was then part of the Russian Empire. However, I am known as Eliezer Ben Yehuda, a meaningful name to me, which I adopted as my Hebrew name after moving to Jerusalem.
Under the care of his uncle, Eliezer joins a Jewish Bible school, a yeshiva.
I am, however, also interested in secular literature, which is why I have to leave not only the yeshiva, but also my uncle's home. But then things happened that'll affect the rest of my life. A very kind gentleman, Mr. Samuel Naftali Hertz Jonas, takes me into his home. During the almost 3 years that follow living with the Jonas family, I also get an education.
First, he learned traditional Judaic studies, and then he got to know the secular studies, and then he learned at the gymnasium, and then he became a very nationalistic. He had very nationalistic ideas.
During this time, Eliezer was taught in different languages by a young lady, Deborah Jonas, the oldest daughter of the Jonas family. They will eventually marry. Not even 20 years old, Eliezer developed a clear vision for Zionism.
Those days there was a war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, and one of the goals of Russia was to liberate Bulgaria from their oppressors and to give them independence. And at the end they succeeded and Bulgaria had its independence. And he was very enthusiastic about it. He had empathy for them. And then all of a sudden he is describing it in his memoirs. He says, all of a sudden I said to myself, if such a nation like the Bulgarians could succeed to have their independence, their liberty, so why not our nation, our ancient nation? We should become again an independent nation in our own homeland, which is Palestine, Eretz Israel, but we have to have a language of our own. And actually we have a language of our own, but people don't really use it for daily use. So let's do it. So that was, when he thought about this first time, he was 17 years old. He had this idea.
The origin of this idea was a vision that Ben Yehuda saw in a dream when he was young.
It was as if the heavens had suddenly opened, and a clear incandescent light flashed before my eyes. And a mighty inner voice sounded in my ears, the Renaissance of Israel on its ancestral soil.
Ben Yehuda later moves to Paris for a couple of years to study medicine. Even back then, he suffered from severe tuberculosis.
My dream of a Jewish home in Eretz Israel, with Hebrew as the national language, leads me to the conclusion to emigrate into Palestine. I convey my decision to Deborah, and she decides to join me on this path.
In August 1881, they meet in Vienna and set off on a ship to Jaffa. They get married on the way and arrive in Jaffa as a newlywed couple. They then settle in Jerusalem.
When Ben Yehuda made Aliyah, there were people actually from all over the world. What was the language there? You had Russian, Turkish, English, German. How did they communicate?
You also had Yiddish. You also had Ladino, Jewish, Judeo-Spanish. And as Gabi said before, Ben Yehuda thought that the only way all these different Jewish communities could communicate and also become united and unified would be through a common language. And for him, it was obvious that it should be Hebrew.
Could you imagine how he felt when he arrived first time in the land, 1881? Do you think he felt, well, I'm in the wrong place, I will go back?
Well, I'm sure he was in shock because after being born in Belarus and spending time in Paris, I'm sure this was very backward for him. But again, his driving desire and his total commitment to the cause led him to push forward. And unlike some Zionists who came to Palestine, he didn't leave for a few years and then come back again. He made a success of it from the start.
Palestine, or Israel, as I prefer to call it, is the place of my destiny. I have to live and work among my own people. The day is short, and the work to be done, so great.
Having arrived in Jerusalem and with complete determination, Ben Yehuda starts his life work, the renewal of the Hebrew language. As a gifted writer, he publishes articles in Hebrew as a guest author.
It was, in these days, it was forbidden to use Hebrew as a normal language. And he got in big troubles.
That's right. There were the ultra-Orthodox people who didn't want any secular studies at all, and of course they didn't want it in Hebrew.
They thought that Hebrew was the sacred language that should be only used for prayer and for liturgy, and they were aghast that someone would try to use Hebrew for secular purposes, and it exists even today.
What time was Hebrew spoken the last time here in the land?
Well, no one knows for sure, but it's usually thought that it's sometime around the 2nd century CE. But it was spoken continually throughout the Middle Ages, up into the modern period, in the synagogue.
People did already write in Hebrew not only sacred things, but also novels and poems, etc. But they didn't have the idea that it should be revitalized as a spoken language. But Ben Yehuda insisted we have to make it a daily language. And starting, for example, with his wife, they swore to each other, they took an oath that they are not going to speak any other language, and also not with their children. They raised all of their children to hear only Hebrew. And then he persuaded another 3 families to speak only Hebrew.
Within a short time, Ben Yehuda publishes his own newspaper called Hatzewi. He spreads his vision with fiery words and literary genius, all in Hebrew, of course. He receives relentless opposition, especially from the ultra-religious circles based in Jerusalem. But he garners fervent followers of his vision. These are found primarily among the immigrants from Eastern Europe.
I was awake all night. It's the day of the birth of our first child. On the same day, we receive a telegram. A group of immigrants urges me to come to the inauguration of the newly founded colony today, not far from Jaffa. They claim it is also my baby after all. How am I supposed to explain that to Deborah? But my wife understood, and she said I should also be present when my second child arrives on the same day.
This new colony is named Rishon LeZion. We make our way to Rishon LeZion, now the 4th largest city in Israel. There, we visit the museum of these first settlers who were so inspired by Ben Yehuda. Gottfried Bühler meets Tal Hamelech. She is an expert at the Rishon LeZion History Museum. She takes us into the classroom of the school, set up by the settlers. Ben Yehuda's plan to propagate the Hebrew language among the people was through the children.
We're in an original school class. Can you tell me more about that?
In Rishon LeZion, they started teaching the Hebrew language in 1888. When they opened the school in 1886, they studied in French. The thing was that Eliezer Ben Yehuda and other friends, they thought that coming here is not enough. It is also very important to revive our ancient language. Reviving our ancient language and speaking in our own language, it connects you to the land, it connects you to all the culture. But since Hebrew was considered a dead language, and only when you prayed you used the Hebrew, there weren't everyday words in Hebrew. And Ben Yehuda, when he revived many words, he took them from the Bible. These people who wanted to revive the Hebrew language knew that the right thing to do is to go into these colonies and to teach the kids the Hebrew language. And why the kids? Because they knew that the kids come home and the kids teach the parents the new language. Mm-hmm. And this is how it happened. It wasn't a one-day process. It was a gradual process. But, it was a very interesting process because I don't know in the history of modern times an ancient language being revived and succeeding in the revival of the Hebrew language. The method of teaching Hebrew is also interesting. It's called Hebrew in Hebrew, meaning you don't translate, let's say you have a book. So you don't say Sefer and a book. And that's how the thing operated, that you don't translate it not to German, not to Russian, not to any other language the kid knows. The kid has to understand what you mean. If this word doesn't catch the ear of the kids, it fades away, you know? And so Ben Yehuda had an idea. He always had a few words. And so when the teacher came into the classroom, he introduced the few names, and what caught the child's ear, that's what stayed. They thought of everything, of how the kids would get to like the language. The way of teaching kids a new language is teaching them songs. There weren't many songs in Hebrew. And so one of the songs that was chosen was Hatikva, or Tikvatenu. It was called Our Hope. And it was a song written by Naftali Herz Imper, who was a known poet. And the teachers in our Hebrew school, they knew him, they met him, and they knew his song. And so they decided to teach the kids the song. The kids studied it immediately, they loved it, and it went to all other settlements in the land of Israel, and and even abroad. And so this is how Hatikva started.
The first immigrants were real pioneers. Their lives were hard and they had to sacrifice a lot. Like Eliezer Ben Yehuda, they believed they were fulfilling the predictions of the old biblical prophets about the restoration of Israel. The idea to establish the Hebrew language through education is fruitful. More and more schools begin to teach Hebrew. Years later, the first only Hebrew-speaking high school is opened in Jaffa. With increasing success, new words have to be invented for everyday needs.
How was it to create new words? The Hebrew language in these days, they didn't have a word for locomotive or automobile or theater or tomato. How did he manage it to create words?
One of his first words to coin was the word for newspaper. It's Iton in Hebrew. How did he coin it? He took the word in German, Zeitung. Zeitung is, as you know, Zeit plus which is, so Zeit, he took the word Zeit in Hebrew, et, plus suffix, and there is a word.
The German language gave him literally foundation.
Yes, absolutely. In a way, yes, but other languages as well.
Well, there were a few possible sources. One was going through ancient Hebrew sources, finding words that were not properly understood or were rare, and using them, infusing them with new meaning. Another source was taking words from Aramaic. Now, Aramaic was a closely related Semitic language that accompanied Hebrew since about 1000 BCE, since the time of King David.
So he spoke Aramaic?
Well, he spoke Aramaic as a learned language, like Latin in the Middle Ages. Another source was Arabic. And Ben Yehuda loved to go to Arabic because of its large vocabulary. And his view was that if it's in Arabic, it might have been, or it must have been in Hebrew too, in ancient times, and just didn't survive in Hebrew. And so he would frequently turn to Arabic, use Arabic roots, and other times he would be influenced by European languages. And if a word sounded like something common in a European language, he would create it. So he created the word for doll, buba, in Hebrew.
Puppe.
Exactly, exactly. And he did that with many other words too.
So he must have been fluently in many languages.
He was very fluent in many languages, both ancient and modern. So he was really, in this way, he was really a genius, and he used all these things.
In order to spread Hebrew among his people, yet another way shall open up to Ben Yehuda. Boris Schatz, an art professor who immigrated from Sofia, is founding the Bezalel Academy of Arts in Jerusalem. Ben Yehuda promises his full support, providing that at the academy only one language will be spoken, Hebrew. Schatz agrees. Today, the Bezalel Academy of Art and Design is the only one of its kind in the Middle East. Gottfried Bühler pays a visit to the Bezalel Arts Academy and talks to Adi Stern, the school principal.
Boris Schatz established this institution here in Jerusalem. He was from Sofia. Why did he come in these days to Palestine, establishing a school for art and design?
It's an interesting story. This guy, Professor Schatz, came from Sofia, that's correct, but initially he was born in Lithuania. And he was called to Sofia in order to establish the Royal Art School, Art Academy, the Bulgarian Art Academy, and then so he had some experience, so to speak, in establishing art schools. But in those years he became a Zionist, and he was in close contact with Zionist leaders. And they together came up with this idea of creating an art school in Jerusalem at the time. And it is indeed very forward-thinking to create such an institution here in Jerusalem at that time, because it was a very poor city.
So your name is very interesting, Bezalel. Yeah. And it appears also in the Bible.
Absolutely.
Does it has a meaning today for you, for the students?
Well, the name comes from the Bible, and Bezalel was the first artist mentioned in the Bible. He was the one who planned the tabernacle, and actually the name itself means in Hebrew, in the shadow of God, Bezalel. Does it have a meaning today? I think it does, because we hold a very unique history and tradition for this country. And we are the oldest institution in the country. We were established way before other institutions, way before the state was established, founded. And this connection to history, to heritage, to tradition is important to us. And in a way, it's still the heritage of Schatz.
You're working with old Hebrew letters. Yeah. Why that?
I think, again, it has to do with the history and the heritage, and the fact that the Hebrew script was basically the vehicle that enabled the transformation of the Jewish religion, the Jewish philosophy, everything that had to do with Judaism along the centuries, because Jews were not concentrated in one place, they were spread around the world, and the vehicle was actually the script, the alphabet, that enabled that.
I learned that the old Qumran texts can be read by 10-year-old students. What do you think why this language was preserved over thousands of years?
It's interesting that we can read quite easily texts that were set up or written 2,000 years ago. The fact is that the usage of Hebrew during almost all those 2,000 years was dedicated and focused on religious texts, on the Bible and the Torah, and were not used for everyday secular newspapers, books, etc., etc. This only changed like 200 years ago. So the development of the script was quite restricted. It was not developed as the Latin script, for instance.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
In addition to all his other activities, Eliezer Ben Yehuda now also starts to teach Hebrew lessons at the Bezalel Art Academy, working up to 19 hours a day.
Since my youth, I struggled with tuberculosis. I work as if I only have a few hours to live. I feel like I don't have enough time. My motto hanging on my wall above my desk says, "The day is so short, the work to be done, so great."
He records his word research and notes on thousands of small pieces of paper and cards.
He made millions of notes. And we have original material here. Can you explain?
Yes, actually, this is the way he worked. So he worked with cards. By the way, this is actually the Stut. This is actually the folly.
Stuss? You say in Germany Stuss?
Stuss, yes. It's in Yiddish, Stuss, yes. So what he did, he started to read books from the beginning up to the end. He even says, he complains, some of them were so boring, but I had to read it because I had to extract all the words. And then he took, he put this word I have already, this word. So, and then he put it in this note card, this is his handwriting. But so this is the way he worked. היונים לא תוכלנה להינגף בשטות הכלבים. שמע שטותו בא באוזני רודפו, סדור קבוצותם ואם נסדקו, לחיי קצתם מכלימה אדמו, ופני קצתם מחרי נורקו. צריכים העדים לחקור הדבר היטב, שמא בסוף שטותו או בתחילת שטותו עשה מה שעשה.
How many of these cards?
I didn't count it, but it
preserved
probably thousands of them. We can't imagine our life without his work, without his ideas. That's the important thing.
For years since Eliezer and Deborah Ben Yehuda arrived in Jerusalem, they have been living in great poverty. In late summer 1891, Eliezer Ben Yehuda experiences the worst tragedy of his life. His beloved Deborah dies of tuberculosis.
Since my youth, doctors have told me that I don't have long to live. But now my dear Deborah has died before me from my illness, which is why I didn't want to marry her at first, to save her from becoming an early widow.
Deborah leaves Eliezer with 5 young children. However, just 2 months after Deborah's death, his son Avi and his 2 little daughters, Atara and Shlomit, fall ill of diphtheria. All 3 die within 10 days. Eliezer, in his newspaper, quotes only one short verse from the book of Jeremiah about Deborah's tragic death.
I remember the devotion of your youth, how, as a bride, you loved me and followed me through the wilderness, through a land not sown.